Good evening, everybody. It's the top of the hour, so we will go ahead and get started. Just do a quick time check. If you don't mind, if you can hear me okay, just let me know in the chat window. And I'll do a quick, awesome, thank you. Yay. I'm going to do a quick overview of Zoom. I think now in this era of the pandemic, we are all too familiar with Zoom, but nonetheless, just in case Zoom happens to be a new situation for you. On my screen, it's typically either at the top or the bottom of the screen, the chat window that can pop out and show you what people are saying. We are going to try to have an interactive webinar, so definitely get familiar with your chat window. And if you don't mind to send to everyone, or it perhaps says all panelists and attendees, depending on probably what version of Zoom you have. That way it sends to the entire group, not just the participants or Susan and I, the panelists or organizers of the webinar. And any questions or technical issues, please don't hesitate to just add them to the chat. Go ahead and give you a little bit of an introduction to the lab before we get started. And then I'll introduce the host tonight. I work at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and our mission is to interpret and conserve the Earth's biological diversity through research, education, and citizen science focused on birds. And tonight's webinar is going to be a little bit off the topic of birds. Certainly birds will be a focus, but we're going to be talking more broadly about wildlife in general, and definitely hitting the topics of education and classroom use of wildlife, really, in my mind, through the lens of thinking about exploring and connecting to the Earth's biological diversity. And my name is Jennifer Fee. I'm the manager of K-12 programs. I've worked at the lab for 18 years now, and we're excited with the K-12 team to offer a monthly series of webinars, usually hosted by Kelly. For those of you that have attended many of our webinars, Kelly's been hosting those for most of the last 2 years. I'm excited to do tonight's webinar alongside Susan. Susan, do you want to do a quick intro?
Sure, I'm the education specialist and will be in the chat and answering any questions, or if you have technical problems, I'll be helping you with those tonight.
And one of the reasons that Susan and I were excited to host a webinar focused on bird cams and wildlife cams is because we recently submitted some grants to fund some educational development around wildlife cams. And so we've been thinking about cams as really a window, an accessible window for students to connect to the environment in a new way. Even if you're in a very urban environment or can't go outside, or maybe are worried about getting your kids dressed with their coats and their gloves and everything else to get outside, that wildlife cams can really provide a window into nature that's incredibly accessible and safe and easy. So I also want to welcome everybody to share their ideas in the chat, because I'm assuming that many of you have probably used wildlife cams in your classrooms, or potentially even used the Cornell Lab bird cams in your classrooms. So you may have as much or more expertise as we have in these sorts of things and have resources to share. So please do share them in the chat window. And we are going to send at the end of the webinar, maybe in the next 24 hours or so, a link to or a PDF of the links from tonight's webinar. So don't worry too much about scribbling down some of the ideas that I share or the links that I mentioned, because we will be sending that out. And the reason we want to send that out later is because we're hoping that we will kind of scrub the chat for anything that maybe you've recommended that we think would be good resources on that handout. So definitely share your resources, and we'll form a learning community and make that a better resource for everybody. Okay, introduction to today's webinar. I want to show you some wildlife cams from around the world, focused on birds, but you'll see some images of other kinds of wildlife. And I really would like to go at this thinking versus specific cameras that you might want to use, helping you think about what types of cameras you might want to log into and why. And then also we've got some free resources to share with you. And alongside that, some activities to try out to get you thinking about how you might utilize wildlife cams. And you all are also going to help me discuss and come up with some tips and tricks for getting the most out of wildlife cams in classrooms. All right. First, let's go through what are wildlife or live streaming animal cams. When I think of live streaming animal cams, it's not the exact same thing as trail cams, taking pictures of animals that might be triggered by an animal's motion, but rather live streaming cams can give you a glimpse of the daily life of animals. And often these cams are streaming 24/7. So it's showing you life as it exists on the animal or animals you're watching. And when I look into the types of animal cams, there's a few different ones that you can consider. And, you know, there's costs and benefits of all of these. One type is a number of shelters and farms and that sort of thing show live streaming footage of puppies and kittens and barnyards and that sort of thing. So that's one category that's more domestic animals, shelter animals, that kind of thing. And that's not going to be our main focus tonight. We're really going to more focus on wildlife cams. Although, you know, who doesn't want to look at kittens and puppies? I actually watched some snoozing kittens today as I was preparing for this webinar and found it quite relaxing. So that was nice. And I'm sure that those might have a place in classrooms as well. The second type of animal cam is those that are hosted by zoos and aquariums. A lot of zoos, a growing number of zoos and aquaria are having wildlife cams. For example, you can see the San Diego Zoo hosts a whole suite of different animals, koala cam and baboon cam and polar bear cam. And so that's another option to look at wildlife. But of course, those are captive animals. One of the benefits of looking at captive animals, in my opinion, is probably the amount of activity that you're going to see. You know, they're captive animals, they're in a confined space, and might make it a little bit more accessible that the animals are there doing what they're doing very often, versus true nature or wildlife cams out in the wild. You may get some days with lots of action and some days with no action because the animals are sort of doing what they want to do in the wild. I think there's space for all of these different kinds of cams in classrooms. If you're looking at animal behavior, you know, maybe you want to think about looking at a wildlife cam that's based in nature because the animals are doing what they do in their natural environment. As I said, though, those animals are doing what they want to do in their normal environment. So one potential issue there is you are going to see some possibly distressing or disturbing things, and or the animals may not be active when you log on. You know, I was trying to look at a manatee cam and there are just no manatees that day. So I don't get to see anything. Whereas if I'm looking at the Monterey Bay Aquarium's aquarium camera, I'm going to see the shark circling every day many, many, many times. And so I'm going to get to see that animal going about its routine. Any cameras that you want to share that maybe are ones that you like and what category those cameras fall in? Feel free to just share it in the chat window. Oh, and there's the picture I took of the snoozing kittens. So that's an example of an animal shelter cam. Kittens just snoozed. I barely knew it was a streaming cam, except I could see their bellies rising and falling. The lab has some awesome wildlife cams focused on feeders and on nests. And as I mentioned, the San Diego Zoo has a whole variety of cams focused on their zoo animals. Thanks for sharing. And I was thinking of the diversity of cams that are available. Some of the things that I was thinking about, or maybe decisions you might need to make or choose to make as you're thinking about cams for your classroom. Do you want to look at captive animals or wild animals? There are terrestrial cameras or aquatic cameras. I'm actually shocked by how many underwater cameras there are. And personally, like, I love snorkeling, I love scuba diving, and I've run those cams just kind of streaming because you can kind of hear the bubbling in the background of the water, and I find it incredibly relaxing. You can look for local cams. Many states, for example, Fish and Wildlife, that sort of thing, have local cams. So if, for example, you're in New York or Pennsylvania or California, you may be interested in showing more of a local environment and animals that your kids might actually see out in the wild. And there are also a variety of worldwide cameras. Some of my favorites are in Africa. You know, they'll set up cameras on a watering hole, and maybe you'll get to see zebras and giraffes and that sort of thing in their own environment. Some cameras are focused on single species. The ones that I'm thinking, as some of you have mentioned, are the nest cams. Although those are wildlife cams, like in their natural environment, because they're focused on nests, you're going to see that species raising their young and doing what they do, versus some cameras, like I mentioned, the cameras that are perhaps at a watering hole or in the woods or set up on a feeder might show you some diversity of animals. So think about that. Do you want to watch, for example, a single species living its daily life, or would you rather the kids see some diversity in the animals that are on the camera? And also to consider the life cycle stage. The common one that pops into my mind, as I've mentioned a few times, is nest cams. That's a very common thing because the animals are there, they're doing their business, and it's easy to set up a camera. And the lab has a variety of those nest cams focused on everything from osprey to albatross to owls and common little nesting birds as well, like kestrels. So before we go any further, I was hoping we could have a little bit of a brainstorm, especially those of you that have used cameras in your classrooms. What are some of the benefits that you've personally observed, both from a teacher perspective and from a student perspective? Thanks, Monique, for sharing your idea. Brings excitement to education. Allows students to see animals in their environment that they may not have noticed. Rebecca sounds like she's watching nest cams, get a window into a bird nest. They love that it's real time. So Lisa's talking about biodiversity through Voyager's Wolf Project. So there's a classroom or content connection, real connection to nature. Yes, that's accessible indoors. And just to be sure, it looks like the current Zoom platform set it to send to everyone such that everybody can see your chat if at all possible. Awesome, thank you. Uh-oh. Seems like a slide is out of place. I think later on I'll share some of my ideas as far as thinking about some of those benefits. All right, now let's kick into another brainstorm about ways that you all have thought about considerations as you're choosing a cam. I'd come up with some. Are there any cams that you all feel have worked better in your classroom, or aspects of cams that you have enjoyed? And you can see here, I know somebody's mentioned it already, explore.org is famous now for its variety of cams. And you can see here, they've got everything from dog shelters to, underwater cameras, cat rescues, but then also actual wildlife, wild cams. Any other considerations? Feel free to share in the chat. Oh, Tracy, that's cool. Some cams switch views so you cannot monitor behaviors with the same animal over a period of time. I hadn't even thought about that. I'd love to hear more about that, Tracy, and perhaps others would too. Do you create an ethogram and then the kids like tick off the types of behaviors that they see? As maybe you're thinking and typing, there's some of the things that I thought of when I've been, working with teachers on choosing wildlife cams or thinking about how to utilize cams. One is timing can be important, both from a seasonal perspective and time of day. There are some cameras that are more active in the nighttime hours. A lot of nocturnal birds bringing more prey at night, and some of the cameras give amazing views of nighttime footage, and we'll see some of those tonight. And also the types of activities you wish to feature, that's also going to vary seasonally and by time of day. For example, nesting tends to be, at least in North America, a springtime activity, but one of the reasons why the Cornell lab has featured such a variety of animals is, for example, the albatross actually have a very long, like 6-month nesting cycle, and it doesn't mimic the exact nesting cycle of most of our birds. So it allows us to extend the nesting cycle for teachers as well. Another thing that I would recommend is having a backup camera planned. A couple of times I've thought about using a camera, and when I set it up a couple of days in advance, there's lots of activity, and then 2 days later there is no activity. So I think it's always a good idea, especially if you're going to use it as teaching content. For example, you want to feature content around life cycles, to have a backup just in case the cam you plan to use is either down that day or just not as active. And then the other thing to potentially consider when choosing or using a cam is, especially for nature-based wildlife cams, there could be some unpleasant events that come up, and we'll talk a bit more about this in a moment. But to prep the kids for that as you're thinking about using a wildlife cam. And if your kids are young or maybe upset by those kinds of things, choosing a cam that's more zoo focused, for example. We brainstormed about this a little bit earlier. By way of introduction, some of the benefits of cams in classrooms gives a connection to nature. It can provide support for the STEM content that you want to teach. We've seen that it can promote curiosity and authentic questions. And there are a suite of other social emotional benefits that students can give. A boost of engagement. They can be relaxing. They can relieve stress. And studies have actually shown that looking at cute things and looking at nature can boost your mood as well. So there are some social emotional benefits to it as well that perhaps you've seen in your classrooms. And when I think of CAMs, and I think one of the things that Susan and I have considered is how wildlife CAMs might build connection between students and wildlife. Here's a Stephen Jay Gould quote: "We cannot win this battle to save species and environments without forging an emotional bond between ourselves and nature as well, for we will not fight to save what we do not love." And I think this is important because, you know, if your kids are never probably going to see pandas in real life, but pandas are an important part of the ecosystem, maybe showing them that there's something about watching an animal go about its daily life that really gives you a connection. And I was reading a study recently that there were actually a study from some professors at East Carolina University and Kansas State. And they basically did a survey of people who visited Katmai National Park and Preserve in Alaska. And Katmai also has a streaming wildlife cams. And they surveyed folks who had visited the national park and preserve and people who had just watched the animals at the preserve via an online streaming wildlife cam. And they actually found an equal and in some cases even increased connection to that place and desire to protect it based on the people who had just watched it on the cam. That they had, these folks that had watched the cams had developed a strong emotional connection to the bears that they were watching, even if they never visited it, even if they never had set foot in Alaska or really knew much about Alaska. And they actually showed that those folks had supported conservation action and support of the park equally or better than the folks that had visited the park. Yeah, thank you, Laura. The Decorah Eagle Cam is so popular. Everybody loves that Eagle Cam. And it's been up for a very long time. So, Laura, you've probably seen some things when you're watching the eagles, and those of you that shared, especially birds of prey. One of the things that I've heard a lot from teachers, especially at the elementary level, is how to deal with potentially upsetting events. So here's a picture that shows both sides of the story. One, in the top picture, a snake has gotten into a nest box and is eating an egg. And in the second picture, which is actually a Cornell Lab kestrel cam, male kestrel is bringing a baby snake to feed its mate. So you're going to see both predator and prey, snakes eating eggs and birds eating snakes. You'll see in some cases unfortunate injuries and even starvation. A few years ago, there was it was an osprey cam out west, and it was in the middle of a drought, and there was just not enough food for the parents to feed the babies. And it was so upsetting because basically the babies were starving. They just would not all survive because there just wasn't enough food in the area. And a lot of people were writing to the lab, begging us to do something. And I believe in the end, we ended up turning off the cam just because it was so upsetting to people to see, even though this is a real, real life going on and authentic, it can be super upsetting to see these kinds of things when you feel so powerless to help. And I think that's something that people want to do. They want to help. And another thing that has happened is we've had multi-year cam that's focused on red-tailed hawks. The Big Red and Ezra were their names. And over the years, because they've been nesting there for probably a decade, it's on the Cornell campus, one of the adults passed, and also many of their chicks get injured and or die. I know one of the babies flew off and landed wrong and got stuck on something and ended up having to go to the vet school and later died. And that has been upsetting both to adult viewers and to students who get so attached to watching the animals. So I don't want to necessarily give advice, and I'd love to hear all of your advice about how you deal with that. I mean, my personal bend is you're watching wildlife and these things are happening in nature, whether we get to see them on a daily basis or not, but to also prep you that these things can happen and they do happen, and to potentially talk to your students about that prior to potentially upsetting events happening. All right, we're going to go ahead and move into a bit of an activity and get you to look at some cams and learn a bit about the bird behavior that's going on and other kinds of behavior. First, I'd like to start with observation, because one of the things that we want to connect back to is the idea of connecting kids to the science process through the wildlife cams. Can anybody give me a good definition of what is observation? And how it might be important in your classroom? Yep. Kathy, using your senses to describe the world. Yep, noticing details of what you're watching. And as you can imagine, wildlife cams are an awesome way to get kids observing. So observation is a base of the science process. We've seen, and I'm sure you've seen in your classrooms, that observations often lead to authentic science questions. Why, how, what is going on? And also, people can build their observation skills. So with some scaffolding and encouragement, your students can make better observations over time. And depending on your grade level, as someone mentioned earlier, like you can get into some pretty great observations and questions about behavior and what it is that you're seeing on the cam. So let's practice a little bit of using cams as a tool for observation. I'm going to show you a short video clip of the Panama feeder cam and ask, hopefully all of you have even a little piece of scrap paper next to you and a pencil or pen. I'm going to ask you to draw a quick sketch of the bird we're observing and to write down 3 observations, keeping in mind that observations are the things that you perceive with your senses. So the things that you directly observe, not the conclusions you draw about the things that you're seeing or hearing. And keep in mind too, at least for this camera, the sound is off, but all of your senses are able to be utilized, both hearing and sound are the main ones with the camera, obviously. All right, I'm going to show about a minute clip of this feeder cam. And again, ask for you to do a quick sketch of the animal or animals that you see. And also to write down 3 observations. All right, what do you think? Are we seeing one species or more than one species of bird here? And what are some of the observations that you've made? It's so funny, when I first saw this video clip, it was in a freeze frame and I thought it was two different species because there's obviously two different sized birds here. But then when you actually see the behavior, you're right, it is only one species. Oh, I didn't see the hummingbird. I was noticing the wasps in the background. That's why I was careful. How many species of birds are we seeing? Good observation, Michael. Yep, they're chicken sized. Okay, I think that might be another species that just swung in the background. Yep, Lori's seen there's protection in this habitat. It looks like, I mean, one observation is there are several feeders in the frame. It's an interesting observation that Kathy's making, that it seems like the birds are perhaps behaving a little bit differently from each other. That's a cool question, right? That's something that you could observe and kind of track. Joy, I love that. Even though food is available, the babies do seem to like to be fed by the adults, even though clearly it looks like they're pecking about. The parents are picking up the food and putting it into their mouths. This is me as a parent. My kid can do it herself, but I like to feed her. She likes to be fed. Awesome. So let's identify this species based on your sketch. It's actually number 2, the Gray-Headed Chachalaka. Yep. Let's look again, because one of the main differences, we're picking up on the gray head. There's some confusion between the 2 and the 4. If we go back, look at the beak on the bird. Definitely more of a chicken-like beak. Yep. Gray-Headed Chachalaka, which is just plain fun to say, right? It's a good way to boost observation skills, looking at the details, looking at some of the behaviors. And in case you're not familiar with it, I do want to bring up Merlin Bird Id App, which used to just be focused on some of the most common birds in the United States. But if you haven't used it for a while, Merlin has really grown. It's got many, many species in it from a variety of countries. So Merlin is a good tool to identify birds with, whether you're watching one of our cams, a feeder cam in Ithaca, New York, or Panama, somebody else's feeder cam. You can use Merlin to help you identify the birds and discover more background information about those birds. Yeah, Kathy, thanks for bringing that up. There's now a new sound ID. And in fact, Merlin, you can take a picture now and it will use machine learning to identify the picture for you as well. Really great resource. Now, when you look at cams, when I look at cams too, I find myself drawing inferences as well. So we defined observation earlier, using our senses to perceive the world. It's what we directly see, hear, smell, taste, or feel. So you could encourage your kids to make observations, but what probably is going to happen fairly quickly is they're going to start making inferences. Ideally, you're using background knowledge to draw conclusions or make an educated guess about something you're observing. But basically, it's an interpretation of what's being observed, and it may or may not be correct. Like, I think probably what we're doing is making an inference that those baby chachalakas are, in fact, chachalakas because they're being fed. But personally, I don't know that as a fact. It's something that I would have to look up and look at the babies and figure out, although I assume it's correct based on my background knowledge. I haven't actually looked into that question. So basically inference being an interpretation of what's being observed. Let's give it a little practice. The goose is making a hissing sound. You're hearing that with your senses, so that is an observation. The goose is upset and defending its goslings is an inference. We know from our personal experience of what upset sounds like. We see the goose with its goslings. We assume that the bird is feeling upset and doing a defense posture, but perhaps not. And here's a common inference that I make when my cat purrs. I hear the cat is purring, that's an observation, and I assume the cat feels relaxed. But I just learned a few weeks ago that cats purr for all sorts of reasons, and sometimes it's like kind of to release stress. So sometimes now when my cat purrs, I wonder how he's actually feeling. So observation, something you absolutely perceive with your senses, and inference, something that you are, a conclusion that you're drawing based on context and background knowledge. So let's look at another quick video. Just filmed 2 days ago, and the lab is buzzing about this. It's going to start actually in the evening, and then it's going to show you what's happening the next morning on. I'm assuming I'm not the only one that is deathly afraid that that little chick is going to fall right out the nest. He is very clumsy. All right, I'd love to hear what's your favorite observation that you made? And maybe mark it with an O. And if anyone wants to share an inference, what they think is going on, please mark that with an I, just like I did in the example. Mhm. It's interesting that we all watch the same thing and all of us are seeing different aspects about it. Mhm. Awesome. And I wonder if any of you came up with some questions in your head as well as you were observing. If you have any questions about this, feel free to share them as well. And then challenge you to think about observations like this, turning them into questions, and in fact, using those questions to make additional observations to answer those questions. You know, like a question that I had was, can the baby bird feed itself at all? Just like with the baby chachalakas. It looks like they like to be fed, but I noticed that they could eat on their own. So will that baby owlet be able to eat on its own or not? Okay, so what's going on? This is actually the female great horned owl. She's arriving back at the nest right around midnight with an adult barred owl. And I looked this up, and great horned owls are actually a main predator of barred owls. And so in the subsequent day, she started disassembling the barred owl, which is basically almost the same size as her, maybe a little bit smaller, but super similar size. And if you look up the allaboutbirds.org/Savannah owls, it's on that site, and there's an archive of this footage, and you can probably still see this going on because this just happened the last day or two. All right. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. And one of the reasons I wanted to share this is because we actually have a resource called Cooped-Up-Kids. And one of the activities is about bird behavior. And I find that one of the things that you're most likely to see on camera, whether you're watching a bird cam or another kind of camera, is you're going to notice behaviors. And somebody mentioned earlier ethograms. So you could make an ethogram of specific courtship behaviors or parental behaviors, for example, or you can look at kind of general categories of behavior. But let me go through these really quickly. Birds and other animals spend a lot of time courting. They might sing, display, or defend a territory. Parental behavior, which we've seen a few times, you know, birds building nests, incubating their eggs, feeding their young. Anti-predator behavior, when a hawk, like a sharp-shinned or a Cooper's hawk, swoops in and they scatter. Mobbing behavior, that's all anti-predator behavior, when I know, like when I hear blue jays going crazy in my yard, I automatically look for, is there a predator that they're mobbing, that they're trying to annoy, that they're making alarm calls about? Foraging behavior, fancy science word for eating, finding food and eating it. You're going to see that, especially if you're looking at feeder cams or cams that are tracked on prey that's been left out or that kind of thing. And I've also noticed a lot of feather care, or in the case of mammals and other animals, grooming behavior. Show you a quick video, and there are at least 2 types of behavior going on in this clip. Let's see if we can find them. And again, this clip is from a streaming wildlife cam, from the cam that's in Ithaca, New York. And this is part of our Cooped-Up-Kids resource, which will be on the resource page. So if you want to duplicate this, this is all available in a free download. All right, I know that was quick. I noticed at least 2 different kinds of behavior from these 5 categories. Which ones did you notice? Yep, I was going to say parental and foraging. Curious for those of you that said courtship, because there could be courtship behaviors going on here as well. We may be inferring that the bird that was feeding the other bird may have been courting that bird. In this case, I believe it's an adult feeding a youngster, much like the chachalakas. So that would be parental care, and definitely foraging, the eating. It was also interesting when the grackle flew in, there was kind of that altercation between the grackle and the mourning dove. I don't know if that interaction, that sort of what I would call aggression, probably doesn't fit into any of these categories neatly. There's a lot of behavior going on there. So mourning doves and starlings and other birds just plain eating. And then you've got an adult common grackle, that's a female feeding presumably their baby, their own fledgling, but a fledgling. Here's another mystery. Again, I see at least 2 different kinds of behavior going on in this clip. All right. 2 types of behaviors. Yep. Anti-predator, which is called mobbing, and also the preening. Did you notice the bald eagle in the early clip was really like doing that preening behavior over its feathers? I just feel sorry for birds that are getting mobbed. But those crows are distracting the eagle. You know, one of the inferences I'm making is that eagles probably hunt crows. We could look that up, so it becomes a question. One of the best places to go for answering your questions about birds is our All About Birds site. Looking up American crow, looking up bald eagle, you're going to get some really great information and resources. And there's going to be links on our bird cams to those resources for you. All right, just a few more slides left. I wanted to share our main resource that relates to bird cams. Life in a Nest, it's ideal for grades 3 to 5, but certainly adaptable up and down. It's just 4 lessons. It's available for a free download. Covers a lot of content around life cycles and bird behavior. And this would be in addition to the Cooped-Up-Kids resource that I mentioned earlier and that we'll put in the download. And of course, welcome you to visit the Cornell Lab bird cams. Super curated array of resources. One of the things I really like about it is we do archive a lot of the best clips. So if you're looking for clips of certain behaviors or certain exciting things, you can show that and it's planned for you. So, I mean, the downside of that is it's not live, but it is streaming, it is real. And it could be like, for example, the video I showed today could have just happened in the last day or two. So it is authentic in time. And some final tips for you. Share your efforts with parents. My daughter came home last year. They were watching the Decorah Eagle cams and she was so excited and she wanted to watch the Eagle cam more during breakfast because her 4th grade class was so excited about the cams. Think of ways to connect cams to classroom learning. So if you're doing a science unit or reading a book, think about ways that you might creatively build cams in. If you're reading a book on some species, maybe you want to look up and see if there's a cam about that species and launch with some kind of experience that the kids have that's grounded in watching those animals in real time. Another tip that I've had many teachers share is to share these during downtimes. So as kids are coming in for the morning, as kids are coming in for recess, during breaks, to have cams on, especially cams that have good audio, because the sounds of nature can be relaxing. I know some teachers are able to literally stream the cams 24/7, and the kids tend not 24/7 throughout the school day. And the kids, you might think, would get distracted, but a number of teachers have told me, and I'd love to hear from you if this is true in your experience, the kids don't get distracted except if there's something super exciting going on in the cam, and then maybe you don't mind getting distracted by whatever cool thing is happening. Obviously, one thing that we've mentioned a few times, keeping in mind that it is real life and emphasizing that to the kids, both from the perspective of maybe you're going to see some negative things, but also that this is what the animals are doing in their real life day to day. And it's kind of a window into real animals and their behavior, that's going on in nature every day. And also, of course, to be versatile and always have a backup plan because it is real life and weird things will happen. And so having a backup plan, I'm sure as teachers, you always have a backup plan. I'm probably a backup plan for your backup plan. Any other final tips you might like to share based on your experience? Any cams or resources? I know if you Google wildlife cams for education, there's so much out there to find and to explore. So it's awesome to see from this audience what your tips and tricks are and to get your ideas and links. And Susan and I and the other member of the K-12 team, Kelly, are always willing to answer your questions and to help you think through issues and problems. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us on social media, visit our website, or find us via email, k12lab@cornell.edu. If anybody has any questions, don't hesitate to ask them. Susan and I can weigh in, and we also, it seems, have an amazing group of teachers that has a lot of experience in this area. So teachers, if you have anything to say, answer to any questions that might come up in chat, welcome you to unmute and help us answer those questions or to answer in chat. Susan, do you have anything to add or to clarify?
I was just going to add that if you're looking for your contact hour, just send us an email at the K-12 lab at cornell.edu and we'll send those out, and we will send out the information tomorrow the recording, a link to the recording and the resources as well.
Great. Well, I really appreciate everybody being here. I know it's a long time of year, and with the time change this week, I've been especially tired. And I know all of you work so hard and helping your kids in the classroom all day. And I really appreciate that you've come and spent some time with us. And hopefully we've given you some ideas and resources. So we'd love to hear how it works out for you, and always feel willing to share your ideas and information that you have. Thank you. It's been fun to spend part of my day looking at animal videos. So thank you for giving me this excuse to do just that. And just to let everyone know, next week we have a very special webinar focused on data, and we have a guest speaker from DataSpire named Kristen. And we have our April webinar, Susan and I are especially excited about. It's going to be focused on diversity, equity, inclusion in classrooms. It's a special 1.5 hour long webinar, and it's actually not going to be offered as a webinar, but rather a meeting, so that we can break into breakout rooms. And we've done this, I think this will be our second time doing it as in our annual webinar series, and it was a highlight of last year. So if you're interested in topics of diversity and inclusion in classrooms, I incredibly welcome you to look at and sign up for next month's webinar. Susan, do you want to share a link to the webinar site if you have it handy?
Yes.
And that way, if anybody wants to register for next week's data webinar or next month's JEDI Diversity, Equity, Inclusion webinar, we would welcome, and I'd love to see you again. All right, well, Susan and I will hang out for the remaining 3 minutes to see if any questions come up, but otherwise, thanks for attending, and we'll hope to see you in a future webinar.